Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. It's a pleasure to have you here with us tonight. Tonight's lesson is called The Rise of King Cyrus II and the Persian Empire. We're on the second part following the genealogy of Jesus with the descendant who's called Shealtiel. So I'm just going to start the beginning of the lesson by putting up this table. And this table is actually the genealogy of Jesus, or a portion of it. This is the section from Matthew chapter 1 verses 12 to 17. And this is the scripture which is given to us after the exile to Babylon. And so Jeconiah here, he's actually King Jehoiachin, and Shealtiel is actually his son. So he's the eldest son. And so we mentioned last week that he would be known as an exilarch, or a king in exile. And so this is whose lifetime we're following along now. All of these names that come after here, there's 14 descendants. So we've got Zerubbabel, who will lead his people back into Judah in the future out of Babylonian exile. And then we've got Abiud, Eliakim, Azor, Zadok, Achim, Eliad, Eleazar, Nathan. We've got Jacob, Joseph, the husband of Mary, and of course Jesus, who we're heading towards as the final person, the Lord incarnate in the genealogy of Jesus. It just pays to mention that verse 17 actually speaks about the structure of the genealogy, and it talks about the fact that there was actually 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, so to the beginning of the period of kings. Then we have another 14 generations from King David through to the last of the kings in exile in Babylon. And then we have another 14 generations which go from the period of exile until Christ. And so we have this extraordinary pattern where there's three segments of history in the journey from Abraham through to Christ. So in tonight's lesson, we're going to be having a look at King Nebuchadnezzar's descendants, and we're also going to be introduced a lot to King Cyrus the Great, who will become the head of the Persian Empire, who will release the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. Now on this next table, this is a chart we've been using for some time. So this was the last king recorded in the genealogy. This is Shealtiel, that's here. Now Nebuchadnezzar, we've been following his story up until now, but during the life of Shealtiel, we find that we're going to have a change of three different kings or claimants to the throne in Babylon, and we're also going to come up to this period of time with Nabanitas. Now Amel Marduk, and we'll talk about him, his name is Evil Merodach in the Bible, and when we get to the final descendant in the Babylonians, we come to Beltshazzar, and his name is actually Beltshazzar in the Bible, and we'll actually mention him tonight. Now it's during the reign of Nergal-Sharazer when Cyrus the Great starts to lead the Persian Empire. And it's not an empire at this stage because this is the whole pathway, but this is when it starts expanding from a kingdom in a region, and it gains momentum from there. So we're going to pass through what's the second half of the Babylonian history, and we're going to start into the early parts of the Persian history. We're also going to be having a look at two of the prophecies which Daniel receives in the form of visions or dreams tonight, and I'll come to those when we get there. So beginning the lesson, whilst the Jews were held in captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar, their neighbours the Medes continued to rule over the Persians, and Amytis, the daughter of the Median king, was the wife of King Nebuchadnezzar, and the Babylonians coexisted with the Medians without any conflict at this time. Now when King Cyrus of the Median Empire died, his son Astyages inherited his large empire, and he married a person called Aryenis, who is the sister of a king of Lydia. I'm going to put a map up in a moment to explain this, and that was to seal a treaty between them. These marriages ultimately meant that the new king, Astyages, was able to rule in peace and alliance with his two brothers-in-law. So marriage was always used between kings in order to promote peace and harmony. Now the Persians at this time was ruled by somebody called Cambyses, and he was the king of a place called Anshan since 600 BC. Now he married a princess called Mandane from Media, a daughter of the king and the prince of Media, and the marriage resulted in the birth of Kurus, Kurus, and he was a boy who would take place as the next future king. And I have mentioned a little bit earlier, Kurus is actually the name for Cyrus in the Bible. And so the story will unfold. So this map here is just to help do some explaining to what I've just said. This is the Lydian Empire over here. And so the marriage was to put a seal or a treaty between the Lydians and the Medes. If you look at the size of the Median Empire, it's actually extraordinarily huge. The Bible talks about King Nebuchadnezzar II, and it talks about how he will rule the world. And yet the area is actually this piece here, which is just one portion of this region. The portion that it occupies is a very important portion because of all the river systems. It goes down the side of the Mediterranean, giving them ports. But as you can see, it's not the largest of empires. The Egyptians at this point are still independent as well. And so we find at this time that this place called Anshan is actually the place where King Cyrus the Great, who will become known, the boy that I've just mentioned, this is where his father rules from this kingdom here. Now this area here was formerly the Elamites, which is in Iran today. So the Elamite Empire was a past empire and it no longer exists. The Medes rule from their capital up here at Ecbatana, and over here at Babylon is where the Babylonian Empire is ruled from this location. So this just gives us a little bit of context to all of these people's names and the purpose for the intermarriage to create peace and harmony between the borders of all of these different known empires. Now we're going to go to Psalm 137 verses 1 to 9. And Psalm 137 verses 1 to 9 is actually something which you'll recognise as a worship song which was famously recorded by Boney M, and it's by the rivers of Babylon. And so this is where that tune actually comes from. So it's Psalm 137 verses 1 to 9. So we're going to the people who have been exiled there, the Jewish people. And it reads, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion." I will promise you I will not sing on behalf of Boney M. "There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' But they responded, 'How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy.'" And so from this we can get the picture of how the exiles are feeling. They've been exiled from Jerusalem. It's their home and they're missing their home. It reads on, "Remember, O Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down," they cried, "tear it down to its foundations. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is he who repays you for what you have done to us, he who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks." So this part doesn't come into the worship song, of course, because it speaks about the demise of the Babylonian Empire. And so we see here the role that the Edomites had to play, because there was 4 kingdoms that came together as allies with King Nebuchadnezzar when they wiped out Jerusalem the last time. The Edomites were one of them. The last portion of this obviously talks about the fact that they've already received the prophecy. They understand that the Babylonians will only rule for how many years? 70 years. So this is what the prophet Jeremiah said. So when they actually respond to those who are asking them to sing songs of joy from their homeland, they're actually telling them right at the end, well, guess what? At the end of this period of time, happy is he who repays you for what you have done to us, he who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. And so I can imagine that wouldn't have been very welcome with the Babylonian people. So the Jewish people in Babylonian exile, they're lamenting their captivity by the rivers of Babylon. Restricted to an area bound by the Euphrates River, the Tigris River, their tributaries and the many canals cut for irrigation of crops, all they could do was yearn for the city of Jerusalem. So having a look at this map, we mentioned this in the previous week, but here is Babylon here. This is the Tigris River, this is the Euphrates River, but they're approximately 50 miles or 80 kilometres south east of Babylon itself, and this is the region where the exiles that have come all the way from Judah are being held. So this is that location that they're talking about now. So they're tending their crops and rearing livestock was all that they would ever know. That's that generation. Many of these people knew they would be too old to ever return home and would die in captivity, which would be pretty hard to take, knowing that the prophet said they wouldn't be returned for 70 years. The prophet Jeremiah had sent a letter from Jerusalem conveying the word of the Lord when the exiles were sent with King Jehoiachin. And that's Jeremiah 29 verse 10, which we have looked at in the previous week. But it says, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. You may recall that when Jeremiah wrote this letter, it was sent to Babylon and it was read out to the people who were in exile. So everybody in exile, Shealtiel included, who's in the palace, would know that there's this period of time that's going to have to happen, and they're probably not going to be the ones to make it back home again. And hence when we get to Jeremiah 29:11, the famous prosperity scripture, it's talking about they have to sit down, get on with the job and prosper, meaning they need to have children in order that the next generation would return back to Jerusalem. Last week I mentioned that there was actually a total of 14,000 people roughly after 4 periods of exile who actually went into exile. So you think about the population that came out of Egypt originally, they were in very vast numbers, approximately 2.5 million, with women, children, grandparents and grown men. And when they went into the land of Canaan, it was another generation because they were held up in the desert for 40 years. And the Bible tells us there was only the 2 that actually made it into the promised land. So these people are in exactly the same boat. The difference is, though, they don't have 2.5 million people to re-enter the land. They're down to 14,000 people. And so you can understand why the Lord said to them, look, be happy, build your houses, grow your crops, prosper, have children, because it's the children that we're going to bring back. And so this, of course, is what actually happens. So they were told, as I've just mentioned, it's from Jeremiah 29 verses 5 to 7. It says specifically, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, increase in number. This is what the Lord says through Jeremiah. Increase in number. So this was his true message. Seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. So in other words, they're not in any threat in Babylon. And in fact, we mentioned again last week that every time the Lord kept saying, if you go to Babylon, I will make sure that you're taken care of. The story of King Nebuchadnezzar, where he was put out into the field for 7 years until he submitted himself to the Lord, played a role in this, where he took care of the exiles. Nothing was going to happen to them. But the undertaking that they would never return to their homes left them worried that they would actually just simply forget about Jerusalem. And hence, what's one of the things that happened in the Bible that they did in order not to forget? Any clues on what I'm talking about? It's one of the books of your Bible. What was written in Babylonian exile?
Songs.
Not what I'm looking for.
Okay. Sorry.
No, don't apologise.
Lamentaciones.
Well, there is some laments, but it's a whole book that was written during Babylonian exile. We have the Book of Kings, which was written in a contemporary fashion, so as that period of time happened. And what's the other book that buddies up with the Book of Kings that tells the same story, but maybe the words are a bit different? The Book of Chronicles. Chronicles. It's common. So the Book of Chronicles. So the Book of Chronicles tells the story of what actually just happened before them. So there's only 14,000 people left. The king Zedekiah was taken into Babylonian exile. All of these scriptures, which had been written and translated, most of them would have been destroyed. Because what did they do to Jerusalem? They destroyed it, they set fire to it, they set fire to the temple. Was the descendants being obedient to God before they left? No. Were they worshipping God? No. Were they reading their scrolls? Probably not. And so you can imagine they hurriedly rewrote everything because they didn't want to lose what they knew. And so this is when that book was actually written, or books as it originally was. Okay, so the captors asked them to sing one of the Lord's songs in this psalm, a song of joy, but how could they do this in a foreign land who worshipped a foreign god? They refused and left their harps, as the verse says, hanging on poplar trees. All the while they prophesied future doom and destruction for their captors. The people from Judah had suffered violent deaths at the hand of the Babylonians. That's what they had seen before they were taken into exile. They needed to understand they were going to be protected, but we're talking about what they feel and what their memories were of what happened before they got there. The people of Judah, as I said, they'd witnessed many, many violent deaths. Their infants, remember what happened before they left Jerusalem? Nebuchadnezzar sieged the city. He stopped people from coming in. He stopped people from coming out. And what did they do? People starved to death. Children were eaten. That's how dire it was. Mothers boiled their babies and ate the meat because they were so desperate. And now they sought revenge because, what does the last line say here? He who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. And so now they want the Babylonians' infants to experience the same violent death. So even though God said you are to go there and to prosper, their hearts are in a place where they're not happy, they're lamenting what they've lost, and they want to get back at the Babylonians. So this song that we sing in worship today has a lot to say in its original form from Psalms. So this gives us a bit of an idea of what it was like for the common people who were actually there, left in the land and forced to live in exile. Now, Shealtiel, the descendant that we're looking at, of course, being the king's son, wasn't amongst those people. He was in the northern palace next to the Ishtar Gate in the city of Babylon. His uncle was there, Zedekiah, formerly known as Mattaniah, who didn't have his children with him because they were all slaughtered. Whereas Shealtiel and his brothers and sisters and his father were all there, as well as his mother. And so his life was probably a more normal one than most. But you have to realise, and we're following him as that next descendant, he too would have to realise that he's probably never going to make it back to Jerusalem. And so his heart would have probably been the same. And knowing full well that he was the next in line for the throne, he probably would have been a bit jaded, thinking, well, I could have been the king. And so that's the heart and the experience of those in exile. So moving back to the Babylonians, there's a fellow called Nabu-Suma-Ukin, and he's the firstborn son of King Nebuchadnezzar. So I'll just go back and put this chart up because we've got these various names that are up here, and as we touch base we'll explain our way through them. But he fell victim to a court conspiracy, and he was put in the palace prison near the Ishtar Gate with the former King Jehoiachin of Judah. You'll notice that his name is actually not on the board there. and I'll explain why in a moment. Whilst he was incarcerated, he got to know Jehoiachin and the circumstances by which he and his family were being held. So remember, this is a son of King Nebuchadnezzar. History tells us he was involved in a court conspiracy, and his own father put him in jail to teach him a lesson. When he got put into jail, he found himself amongst the Jewish kings, and also other kings from other kingdoms that had actually been taken into exile from elsewhere as well. And so he found them amongst this company. He learnt that from Jehoiachin that he had been there for an astonishing period of time of 32 years in total by the time he was put into this jail. But when he left, he took on a new name. You ever know that when people take on a regnal name, they actually have a different name often to their birth name? When people become a king or a queen, often their name will change. They'll be appointed a regnal name. And so this is the case for him as well. So, as the eldest son, he was the crown prince, and he was released from prison just before August-September in 566 BC. But when he left, as I said, he took on a new name, and as the eldest son, the heir apparent to the throne of Babylon, so thereafter his new title was to be known as Amel-Marduk, who is now on this list if you look at history. So his name is Amel-Marduk. His name in the Bible is Evil Merodach, and this particular name is in honour of Marduk, who is the god that they worshipped in Babylon. And so this is what they did. They honoured him with this name. And the name actually means a man of Marduk. And so the reason that we've had a look at this is because we come across a scripture in the Bible, in the book of Jeremiah, which I'll come to in a moment, which actually made me wonder, why was King Jehoiachin, who was in prison, suddenly released from prison in his later years to enjoy dining at the king's table? So when I went studying and looking for this in Babylonian history, this is what we found out. And that's that the next king became his mate in prison together. And so we'll carry on and explain the story. So Shealtiel and his brothers, incarcerated with their father in the prison of the northern palace, had always been provided for from the royal storehouse of King Nebuchadnezzar, which we had a look at when we talked about Jehoiachin's ration tablets, which is a tablet which was inscribed, which is still available from history today, which tells you how much food and oil, etc. they were receiving from the king while they were actually in captivity. So they had now reached their 37th year of exile when King Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC. So at this point in time, we see a shift from one king to the next king. So the crown prince Amel-Marduk, who I've just mentioned is called Evil Merodach in the Bible, succeeded him, but when he ascended the throne, he did not forget the man that he had befriended in prison. And so if you go to your Bibles to Jeremiah, and you go to chapter 52, so Jeremiah 52, right at the end of Jeremiah, and we're looking for verses 31 to 34. As I said, when I read this part of the Bible, I always wondered, why did this verse appear tacked on to the end of the book of Jeremiah? And it reads, "He released Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and freed him from prison on the 25th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honour higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put aside his prison clothes, and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day, the king of Babylon gave Jehoiachin a regular allowance as long as he lived, till the day of his death." And so if you read that in isolation without any understanding of what's going on, it seems really strange. Why would he pick this random king from the prison take his prison clothes off him, and have him given an allowance, and he now lives in the court of the palace and sits at the king's table. It's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? And yet when we go into history, we find that this same crown prince was actually incarcerated by King Nebuchadnezzar, and so he did jail time with Jehoiachin. And so we have an explanation for what this scripture is actually connected to. So going back a little bit, Jehoiachin was 18 when he ascended the throne of Judah on the 9th of December in 598 BC. He was exiled to Babylon on the 16th of March in 597 BC. So we can know from this that he was in prison for 37 years before being freed by the newly coronated King Amel-Marduk in 562 BC. We can work this out because the Bible tells us that he was released from prison when the new king came. And so we're able to place dates on this event. Part of the relevance of this is that we can know from this that King Jehoiachin in exile was now aged 53 years of age. Now this is the last of the public record, of the biblical record for King Jehoiachin. So we don't know what happens to him after this. He's no longer part of the biblical story, and there's no further recordings historically for him either. But we get to see that a man who was taken from Judah and put into exile actually got to live an extended life, a majority of it in prison, but ending up coming out of prison and living what would have been a luxurious life with the king of Babylon. And so Shealtiel, who is his son, I would imagine would have ended up being released from prison along with his father and his family, if that was the case. And so Shealtiel's life would have changed at the same time. Now Shealtiel, as we've mentioned, has no written story in the Bible, and yet he's in the genealogy of Jesus. And so we're living his story through the events that surround him. So there are no known surviving records that shed any light on the reign of this Babylonian king, who's called Amel-Marduk, but it seems he did believe that Jehoiachin was being held by his father without a just cause because he released him from prison. King Nebuchadnezzar also had a son-in-law called Nergal-Sharazer, and he's named Nergal-Sharazer in Jeremiah chapter 39, verses 3 and 13. And so when we look on the genealogy table here, there he is here. And so he's the next one who's written in line. So once again, the biblical records through the book of the prophets is identifying the historical change of kings in the Babylonian Empire. And so we now move on to Nergal-Sharazer. He was sent to Jerusalem, so we've actually come across him. He was sent to Jerusalem as one of the king's officials when they ended the city. He was there when the city wall was broken, and he was there when the prophet Jeremiah was safely released from the courtyard of the guard. But later in 560 BC, after his brother-in-law Amel-Marduk had ascended the throne and reigned over the Babylonian Empire for just 2 short years, he murdered him and took the throne for himself. And so again, we don't know what happened to Jehoiachin, we don't know what happened to Shealtiel, but perhaps this was the end of their journey at that point in time as well, we don't know. But we know that this particular king only reigned for 2 years because the historical record tells us that he was actually murdered. In 559 BC, moving across to the Persians now, the throne of Cambyses I, the king of Anshan, who I mentioned on that map. So here's Anshan here, at this location, was inherited by Kurus at Pasargadae. Kurus is thought to mean like the sun, spelled K-U-R-U-S, and it's an old Persian name for Cyrus, who the Holy Bible calls Cyrus, king of Persia, and there's a reference to his name there in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 23, and also in the book of Ezra for the first time now, chapter 1, verse 1, because Ezra starts with a bit of genealogy in it. And so here we find the introduction of the person who's going to release the Jews from Babylonian exile. History remembers him as Cyrus II or Cyrus the Great. One of the first things the new king of Persia did was to move the capital to Susa, which was the former Elamite capital. And Susa is the place that comes up in Daniel's prophecies, which we're going to come to. And that is located here. Okay, so there was a state or a territory known as Susiana, and this is the capital of that region. So he moves from Anshan up to Susa. Between 557 and 556 BC, King Nergal-Sharazer of Babylon faced opposition from a fellow called Apuasu, who was a king of Perindu, to his west in Cilicia Aspera. I'll just change the screen again. And so as I mention these names, this is Cilicia here. Cilicia Aspera and Cilicia Campestris. So these two locations right at the top of the Mediterranean there. Apuasu mustered an army to set out and plunder Babylonian-controlled Cilicia, Campestris and Cappadocia, which was called Syria by the Greeks. Although mature of age, King Nergal-Sharazer not only led his Babylonian army to stop the threat, he went on and destroyed Cilicia's cities until he reached the border with Lydia and returned home. So what this tells us now is that people are starting to conflict with the Babylonian Empire. Now the Babylonian Empire only goes for 70 years, so it's going to come to an end for a reason. And as soon as one empire brutally takes over regions, there's always going to be someone who brutally fights back because they don't want to be overcome by them. So it's starting to happen. So between 557 and 556 BC, King Nergal-Sharazer of Babylon faced opposition from this Apuasu, the king of Perindu, as he was called, to his west in Cilicia, and he mustered this army. Now, soon after his return, King Nergal-Sharazer died in April 556 BC. So again, we have another king who didn't last for long. And if we go back, sorry for changing the screens, but if we go back here, we notice that he only ruled for 4 years. So Amel-Marduk 2 years, this king only 4 years. So we're seeing this rapid change of kings. When you have a rapid change of kings, it does devastating things to a kingdom or an empire because the stability goes out of the window and people take opportunities when this happens. So he was to be succeeded by his son Labashi-Marduk, who is on this list right here. But he barely had the opportunity to reign, as he was murdered in a few months later in a conspiracy. So as I was saying, there's turbulence, there's changing. His son didn't make it. It doesn't have any historical record for who's responsible, but it was thought that this coup d'etat was led by a fellow called Nabu-Naid, who we know in the Bible as Nabanitas. And so he is the next descendant on this list here. So his name is Nabanitas. So we've had this rapid change in a few years. Ever since Nebuchadnezzar went, we see a very fast domino effect happening in the rule of the empire. And his son, Beltshazzar, was led by Nabanitas and his son Beltshazzar in an agreement with the nobles of the court. So this is historically recorded, because it was Nabanitas who ascended the throne of the Babylonian Empire. And so that literally very rapidly brings us almost to the end of the journey of the Babylonian Empire, and we end up in these stories now which the biblical content has a reference to. So we'll explain that as we go. Now, one of the reasons behind the murders, they believe that Labashi-Marduk was murdered because he was unfit to rule, because apparently he was a very young boy still, and nobody wanted this to happen. So this is how they dealt with him. Now, his origins, funnily enough, is actually not clear, because he himself said that he was from unimportant origin. So in other words, he wasn't a member of the royal family. He's someone who's come in from outside as a member of the court. He certainly was not from the ruling dynasty, nor was he a family member of the former king. Now there's a clay cuneiform cylinder known as the Nabanitas cylinder from Sippar. I'll just put this next picture up. And this is the cylinder here. So they call it Nabanitas because it's about him. Now these cylinders, they basically had a pole go through the middle of them, and they would actually just rotate the cylinder on the rod, and that's how they would read it. So just like a rotating circle, and so that's why they call them this cylinder. And as you can see, it's written in the cuneiform, and what it actually said on here is it said that this particular king restored 3 temples early in his reign. So that means that he was restoring some stability back to his empire. And it says that Whole temple of the moon god Sin in Haran. So Haran, of course, is where Abraham left his father. And back then, when we were talking about how people went there to worship the moon god called Sin. And so that's still the case all these years later. There's another temple called Ebabar for a sun god called Samas in Sippur. And Sippur is here. And then there was a third one, the shrine of the warrior goddess Ananitu, also in Sippur. So the historical record for this particular king means he set about trying to restore some stability back into his kingdom. And you've got to remember that Nebuchadnezzar met with the Lord and protected the Jewish people within his empire, but that didn't mean that his people were worshipping the Lord either. Now he believed that the temple in Haran was the favourite residence of this god called Sin, who had become angry with his people and allowed the Medes to destroy it. But now that King Nabanitas ruled the Babylonian Empire, he said early in his reign, and this is quoted from what he said, Marduk, the great lord, and Sin, the luminary of heaven and the netherworld, stood together. Marduk spoke to me, Nabanitas, king of Babylon, carry bricks on your riding horse, rebuild Eholhul, and cause Sin, the great lord, to establish his residence in its midst. Expressing concern that the temple was surrounded by the Medes, Marduk said to him, the Mede whom you mention, he, his country, and the kings who march at his side will be no more. Now, when we had a look at the map, you can see the size of the Median Empire. It's huge. And so they're talking about them destroying things down here, the temples, and temples up here, which means that historical records telling us that the Medes on this side were also having incursions into the Babylonian Empire. And so we get this picture from these events from Cilicia and also from these, that they had opponents who were coming to attack them. Now it says here, the Mede whom you mention, he, his country, and the kings who march at his side will be no more. Well, of course, that's exactly the opposite to what happens. So King Nabanitas launched successful campaigns against Cilicia and the land of Edom, funnily enough, early in his reign. But the Nabanitas cylinder from Sippar also said, at the beginning of the 3rd year they aroused him, Cyrus, the king of Anshan. So he becomes in the historical record as their opponent. His second in rank. He scattered the vast Median hordes with his small army. He captured Astyages, the king of the Medes, and took him to his country as captive. Such was the word of the great Lord Marduk and of Sin, the luminary of heaven and the netherworld, whose command is not revoked. The 3rd year was 553 BC. And so here we see the rise of King Cyrus the Great. He's starting to build his empire because he was down here, and now he overcomes the king from up here. And so we're going to explain that a little bit further. We're in a part of the Bible where the historical record gives us the backstory for all the events that happen in the Bible. So when we read the Bible, we often come up with a new person, like King Cyrus the Great, and he comes and he releases the Jews to go back. But do you ever wonder, well, who was he? Where did he come from? And why on earth is he releasing them? And so the only way we can really find this out is by actually studying these people in history and finding out who they are, where they came from, how they rose to power, and then more specifically, how God used them. Nebuchadnezzar did the same. He fought as the crown prince leading the army for his father, and then he ended up becoming the king. And then he fulfilled what God prophesied through Jeremiah. And then they said that you would have a rule for 70 years, the demise of the kingdom. So in order for that to come to an end at 70 years, 10, 20 years before the end of the empire, the next one has to be active, starting to do something in order to take over it. And so we're introduced to the new king of the Persians, King Cyrus the Great. So crowned Cyrus II, the grandson of King Astyages of Media, was forced to recognise the overlordship of the Median Empire led by his maternal grandfather. According to a Babylonian clay cuneiform tablet called the Nabanitas Chronicle, it says King Astyages sent a Median army to attack the new king. And so this is a picture of King Cyrus II, or King Cyrus the Great, who we know in the Bible. So this is him sitting on his throne. This small picture here is a picture of Mede soldiers, and they actually all defined in history by a different form of headwear. Their beards and their clothing has variations in it, and so we can actually determine exactly whom they actually all are. So this message read, "The 6th year of Astyages mustered his army and marched against Cyrus, king of Anshan, for conquest. The army rebelled against Astyages and he was taken prisoner. They handed him over to Cyrus." So we find out that there's a rebellion on the Medes side. "Cyrus marched to Ecbatana, the royal city. The silver, gold, goods, property, which he carried off as booty from Ecbatana, he took back to Anshan." And so we find out here that they had this conflict and he took over this major empire. Now, there's a story attached to this, as there always is. In his 6th year of reign, King Cyrus II gathered his army on this plain of Pasargadae. So I'll just put the map back on. Bear with me. So this is here. He ruled from here, but he gathered an army here, the record tells us. And a 3-day battle ensued against the army of the Medes, who came down from Ecbatana here. So they came down to here, and this battle happened between the two. The 3-day battle ensued, but it was all not what it seemed, for the general called Harpagus had changed sides, as we just learned. So here's the story behind what happened. The events are explained by the Greek historian Herodotus. He said that King Astyages of Media asked General Harpagus, a member of the royal house, to take a boy born to his daughter Mandane and her husband King Cambyses of Anshan and kill it. Do you know who that boy was? Cyrus the Great. So, as I said, he was actually born from a Median marriage to a Persian marriage. So that boy who was told to be killed by the king was in fact Cyrus the Great. So this is where God steps in. King Astyages dreamed that Cyrus II would become a king to overthrow him. But when he was born, Harpagus didn't want to see him killed, so he gave him to a shepherd called Mithridates to raise as his own son. When Cyrus reached the age of 10, King Astyages discovered he was alive and punished Harpagus by killing his only son. This is a quote, and it says, "Astyages, when the son of Harpagus arrived, cut his throat, divided him limb from limb, and having roasted some pieces of the flesh and boiled others, he caused them to be dressed for eating." It's horrific, isn't it? The king fed Harpagus, his own son, during a banquet, and then sought the counsel of his priests to decide what to do with Cyrus. They said the boy had been discovered playing a game called King of the Mountain with his friends. So the prophecy was deemed fulfilled and his rise to the throne considered an act of play. So in other words, that prophecy was deemed to be the action of a game rather than real life. So this poor old Harpagus has had his son killed and fed to him saving Cyrus, when in fact Cyrus was let go as an outcome. So no longer considered a risk, he was sent back to his parents, King Cambyses and Mandane, back in Anshan. Now apparently history says that Harpagus didn't react, he just waited for the right time. He continued to campaign and win battles for his king whilst dedicating himself to turn the nobles against him. When Cyrus became king of Anshan, the time was right. Harpagus sent word to him to say if he rebelled against King Astyages, he would lead the Median army into battle against him, and they would mutiny on the field and join forces with him. This they did, and Harpagus had his revenge. And so that's how the Medes and the Persians came to be one empire, and Cyrus was a little boy who was hidden with a shepherd. And that's how it all happened. And so that's the backstory to how this bigger empire got absorbed with a much smaller kingdom. So amongst the splendour of a powerful and successful Babylonia, there was no position for a court scribe. So we're going back to the biblical side of the story now, to keep records for the former kings of Judah. So we know that they kept records every year. It is not known when King Jehoiachin or King Zedekiah died, and apart from the record of rations pressed into the clay, the son's Shealtiel is not mentioned by name. He is, however, listed in the genealogy of Jesus, as we mentioned, not just to prove he was a descendant of Abraham, but in fact he was there to fulfill God's covenant with Abraham that from his seed would come the future Messiah. So despite being held in captivity, Shealtiel became a father, and for this reason he's not only listed as the son of King Jehoiachin in the Book of Chronicles and the Gospel according to Matthew, but as the father of Zerubbabel in the Book of Ezra, the Book of Nehemiah and the Book of Haggai. So he's mentioned many times in genealogy, but he has no independent story. There's no historical documentation of his captivity by name, nor a personal story in the Bible. But this is hardly surprising, for when the prophet Jeremiah gave the word of the Lord concerning King Jehoiachin and his children, what did he say in Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 30? He said, "Record this man as childless, a man who will not prosper in his lifetime, for none of his offspring will prosper, none will sit on the throne of David or rule any more in Judah." And so that prophetic word of Jeremiah said, record this man as childless. Now Shealtiel has no record. And so we almost see that this fulfills this prophecy. So in the same year that the Persian army of King Cyrus was joined by the mutinous Median army under General Harpagus, Shealtiel had been captive in Babylon now for 46 years. Arriving when Nebuchadnezzar was king, he survived the change from his son of Amel-Marduk to Nergal-Sharazer, and then when Labashi-Marduk was murdered, he became subject to the authority of King Nabanitas. Now in 553 BC, he became subject to the authority of yet another. And this time it was the king's son, Beltshazzar, who is known as Beltshazzar in the Bible, because King Nabanitas decided to leave the city of Babylon to live and rule from the rich desert oasis of Tamar, deep in the Kedrite territory of the Arabian desert. And so, when we have a look at this map, which I put up a bit earlier, this is Tamar down here. So it's a long way from Babylon. And so Nabanitas took off down here, and he left his son to rule in Babylon, and Daniel was with him. And this is where we come up to the story a little bit later of the writing on the wall. Okay, so we're heading towards that story now. So he moved all the way down here to this place called Tamar. So Belteshazzar, as I said, was appointed the king of Babylon, not of the whole empire, but to rule Babylon. And in the first year of his reign, Belteshazzar, who is Daniel, had a dream with visions that passed through his mind as he lay on his bed. And so we're going to pass through this historical portion now into this biblical portion, and we're going to talk about the prophecies of Daniel. And so this is where you may have some learning, and we may be able to teach you and explain in detail. Now we have to understand as I'm going, the prophecies of Daniel cover a huge amount of history in reality. So when people are wondering what it's all about, the Bible itself does explain much of it, but history actually bears out the story and fulfills the prophetic words. And so there's a lot of history to cover to actually cover what Daniel prophesies. So Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea." So that's in Daniel chapter 7. So we're reading from Daniel chapter 7. That's from verses 2 to 3. I'm not going to read all of the scripture. You can read it later, but we're going to cover the main details. Daniel described the four beasts. He said the first was like a lion with wings of an eagle, whose wings were torn off. It was lifted from the ground to stand on 2 feet and given the heart of a man. And so we have this illustration of the lion with the wings that he describes. So that's the first beast that's described. The second looked like a bear who was raised on its side, and it says it had 3 ribs in its mouth and was told in Daniel 7 verse 5, "Get up and eat your full of flesh." And so this is the bear with the 3 ribs in its mouth. Now it's giving an action to this. It's saying get up and eat your fill of flesh. So this is something that's still yet to happen. The third looked like a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings on its back. It was given authority to rule. And so we have this image of a leopard, 4 wings and 4 heads. And then the fourth beast was not described like any known animal. It had large iron teeth with 10 horns. It crushed, devoured, and trampled its victims. So Daniel was thinking about the horns of the fourth beast when he saw another little one come up among them. This horn had the eyes of a man and a mouth that spoke boastfully, and caused 3 of the bigger horns to be pushed out. Does anyone have any idea of what this is all about? I will explain. But it's very, It's obviously giving us a very graphic image, and each of these beasts represent something, doesn't it? And so he's working his way through these changes. So it says, Daniel then saw thrones set in place. So we're going to go to Daniel chapter 7, verse 9 to 10. It says, "And the Ancient of Days took his seat." Who's the Ancient of Days? God the Father? Jesus? So the Ancient of Days is normally a term for God the Father. Okay, so the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. Now, if you go to the Book of Revelations and you read some of the scripture, you'll see an alignment between some of these descriptions, and also in the book of Ezekiel. Now, a river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. It says, thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were opened. Who knows what 10,000 times 10,000 is? Anyone ever done the maths on that? 10,000 times 10,000 is actually 100 million. 100 million before him. So we see this extraordinary, thousand upon thousands attended him, 10,000 times 10,000, so it was 100 million, stood before him. The court was seated and the books were open. So this is what Daniel is saying. So can you imagine one day going to heaven? How many people after all of the generations on this planet are going to be there? We think the planet's pretty busy now with people rubbing shoulders. These numbers are extraordinary. And so we get a bit of a picture into it. So as Daniel continued to watch, the first three beasts were stripped of their authority, but the fourth beast was slain and had its body thrown into the blazing fire. Then Daniel saw before him, I'm going to read from verses 13 to 14 now, one like a son of man, and that is Jesus, God the Son. Coming with the clouds of heaven, he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And so in this part of the prophecy, Daniel is speaking about Jesus, the Messiah, and that he will come in the future and he will rule and reign forever. And so we've moved through all of these beasts. We've met God the Father in this prophetic word, and then now we talk that Jesus comes into his presence and he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power over all people and all nations. As you can expect, Daniel's mind would have been racing at 100 miles an hour. He would have been perplexed about all of these beasts, and then he would have been perhaps excited or overwhelmed by what he saw in terms of God the Father and Jesus. So from among the thousands of angels who attended the Lord, he asked one what his visions meant. And so in verse 18 of Daniel chapter 7, the angel answered, "The four great beasts are four kingdoms that will rise from the earth." Now, I've got this on the board behind me, and we'll look at that in a moment. But you may remember that 50 years earlier, and 50 years have passed now, in 604 BC, Daniel interpreted a dream of King Nebuchadnezzar that revealed that there is four conquerors and their empires who are going to come and fall. Does anyone remember who they were? Can't look at the board behind me. So, remember he talked about the statue. They had the statue that was gold, and the head was actually that of King Nebuchadnezzar. Then it had the upper body, which was of silver, and that represented King Cyrus of Persia. And then it had the bronze waist belt down to the knees, and that was representative of the Greek Empire. And then it had the legs, along with the feet and the toes. The legs were iron, the feet were a combination of iron and clay. And that spoke of the Roman Empire. And so when we read this, you might notice here that the fourth animal, it had large iron teeth with how many horns? 10. So who are we talking about? The Romans there. So you'll start seeing the connections. And so this is actually another prophecy that follows the one that he received 50 years earlier. So this new dream that Daniel received again reveals the rise and fall of four conquerors and their empires. The lion is symbolic of the Babylonians, whose torn off eagle-like wings represent the time of insanity of King Nebuchadnezzar experienced when he was humbled by God. So that comes from Daniel chapter 4 verse 17. So we've already covered that. The bear is symbolic of the Persians, who, it says in Daniel chapter 7 verse 5, raised up on one of its sides, meaning that it first needed to overcome whom? The Medes, who we've just mentioned in the historical account. With 3 ribs in its mouth, the bear was told to get up and eat your full of flesh. This represented 3 empires, the Lydian and Babylonian yet to be conquered by Cyrus, and the Egyptian yet to be conquered in the future by his son Cambyses II. And so all of these prophetic words are about future events. The leopard is symbolic of the Greeks led by Alexander the Great, who will rise up swiftly. What's the fastest animal in the world? It's the leopard. So it says they will rise up swiftly to conquer the Persians. Now in Daniel 7 verse 6 it says the 4 heads are given authority to rule. Right? Not 1 head but 4 heads. So they represents a time yet to come when a future Hellenistic or Greek empire will actually split into 4 smaller kingdoms. And so we're going to come up to that as we keep going further forward. And lastly, the fourth beast, with large iron teeth and 10 horns, is symbolic of the Romans, who will come next and crush all peoples, including the remnant Greek rulers and their kingdoms. The angel further explained in verse 24 that 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom, making clear that each horn represents 10 kings of a future Roman Empire. And then also in verse 24, after them another king will arise different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. And again, this fellow turns up in the Bible. Then a different future king will speak against the Ancient of Days, or Most High, and oppress God's saints when he rises and subdues 3 of the 10 kings before being destroyed forever. Finally, in verse 27, it says, the sovereignty, power, and greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be handed over to the saints. Who's that? The saints are you and I. The people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, so we're talking about Jesus, and all rulers will worship and obey him. And so we see 2 components here. We see the historical component being given of all the empires up until the time that Jesus comes and dies on the cross. And then the final component gives us the time when Jesus will actually come back and rule and reign. Now, if you're a Jewish person receiving this prophecy, you'll think that the 4 have already happened and the 5th component is yet to happen. That's the difference that we hold as Christian people, because they don't believe that the Messiah has already come. Okay, so 4 components already happened, 1 component yet to happen. They believe the Messianic age begins in the year 6,000. So they count the days, the years from creation. We're not at 6,000 yet, we're not far away from it, but they believe that that will be the Messianic era, as they call it, when the Messiah will come. So just as the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar was revealed by God to Daniel, God's angel now revealed the meaning of Daniel's dream to be the same. Kingdoms will come and go, but a time will come in the future when a kingdom that will never be destroyed nor left to another people will be established. This everlasting kingdom, unlike any other, will not be ruled by an earthly king, but by the Messiah himself. So one of Daniel's prophetic... so I'll just go to the screen before I go any further. I've just summarised it here. So the lion with wings of an eagle is the Babylonian Empire. The bear raised on its side with 3 ribs in its mouth is the Persian Empire. The leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings is the Greek Empire. And the unknown animal in the shadow in the background with large iron teeth and 10 horns represents the Roman Empire. The Babylonian Empire, we know, succeeded under Nebuchadnezzar II. Cyrus the Great, we're just doing his component of the story now, both in the Bible and historically, and he is the leader of the Persian Empire. Alexander the Great is the one who comes swiftly. He conquers the world very, very quickly. And so he's represented by the leopard, and he, of course, as we know, is Alexander. And then, of course, we get the Roman Empire, and one of the most recognisable of the emperors, of course, is Julius Caesar, who I've put up here. And so that happened in 553 BC. And so we find that one of Daniel's prophetic visions came to pass 3 years later in 550 BC, when King Astyages was defeated in battle after 3 years of fighting. The Median capital Ecbatana fell to King Cyrus the Bear in the vision that Daniel had won. And the Median general Harpagus had his revenge. Not only did all the former vassals of Media come under the command of King Cyrus, but his uncle Arsames, who ruled the neighbouring city-state of Parsa, stepped down from his throne to unify with Anshan to begin a new Persia. Both kings were descendants of the Achaemenids from the first Persian dynasty, so when the Persians united with the Medes, they fulfilled the word of the Lord given to the prophet Jeremiah, Isaiah and Daniel to establish the next dynasty. This dynasty becomes known as the Persian Achaemenid Empire in history. Now, in the same year that happens, Daniel receives another vision in 550 BC. It's now the third year of King Beltshazzar's reign in Babylon, and Daniel had another vision. This time he saw himself in the new capital of the Persian Empire, beside the Uli Canal, and it says in Daniel chapter 8 verse 2, he was in the citadel, which is a fortified royal palace of Susa in the province of Elam. So you might remember I mentioned Susa on the map. And so this is our final screen for tonight, and I will begin to explain the next prophecy of Daniel. So Daniel said in chapter 8 verses 3 to 4, I looked up, and there before me was a ram with two horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged towards the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. And so we seem to be on another prophecy, and we switched to yet another animal, haven't we? So this is why it can be a bit bewildering. But as is with his vision 3 years earlier, Daniel thought about what it meant. And in Daniel chapter 8 verse 5 it says, when suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. Daniel described how the goat charged and attacked the two-horned ram in such a rage it shattered his two horns. Unable to stand against the goat, the ram was struck down and trampled. The goat then became more powerful, and at its peak his one prominent horn broke off to be replaced with 4. Keeping up with all this? A lot of stuff, isn't it? To be replaced with 4. So we're going to read from verses 9 to 12 of Daniel chapter 8. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. Where's the beautiful land? Jerusalem. Okay. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice was given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Now you might notice here it talks about starry host, host of heaven, starry host, prince of the host, daily sacrifice, the place of the sanctuary brought low, and then it goes on with because of the rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. So we're actually talking about the practices of the Babylonian Empire. Okay? And so we'll continue to explain. The Persian Empire, beg your pardon. Daniel then heard an angel speaking, and another angel said to the first in verse 13, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the host that will be trampled underfoot. The angel told Daniel in verse 14, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. Any idea what that's about? Anyone familiar with all this prophetic word? So what's going on here, and again we'll keep explaining it, the rebellion that causes desolation in the sanctuary is that when the Greeks went into the kingdom of Judah and the Jews had already been returned, they rebuilt the temple, didn't they, with Zerubbabel? Well, when the Greek Empire went in, they desecrated the temple. And what did they do? They placed a statue of the god Zeus Olympus in the temple of Jerusalem. This is known as the Desolation. There's a few different terms, I'll mention them in a moment. So they're talking about a future event that's going to happen. So what we're talking about now is that all of the starry hosts that have been trampled, this is the practice of the Persians. Right? A lot of what they worshipped was the stars and the moons. They were into horoscopes and all of the rest of it. And so they said they're going to trample all of this down. The Greeks are going to come and knock it down. But as the Greek history progresses along, they want to place their gods over above all other gods in the territories which they rule. And one of the events that happens, of course, is the desecration of the Temple of Jerusalem. Now, it puts a time here. The angel told Daniel it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. So we know there's how many days in a year? 365. So if we divide 2,300 evenings by that number, we know how many years until it's actually taken back out of the temple again. So whilst Daniel watched and tried to understand the vision, the archangel Gabriel came and spoke to give him its meaning. So we're going to read now from Daniel 8 again, verses 20 to 22. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king, which is Alexander the Great. The four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. The archangel Gabriel explained the four splintered and rebellious kingdoms would be ruled by kings who would become wicked until, in verses 23 and into the beginning of verse 24, it says, "A stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power." The archangel Gabriel continued to explain what this powerful master of intrigue would do. So carrying on from verse 24, he says, "He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes, yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power." And so he's going to stand against God. He's going to desecrate the Temple of Jerusalem. He is the Greek descendant that they're actually talking about. And so these number of days helps you work out the date and the period of time. So finally, in verse 26, Daniel was told to seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. And so we have multiple things happening in Daniel's prophecies. So firstly, before I finish off tonight, we'll just review this. The picture shows the ram and the goat. These two characters are said the two different horns. One represents the Medes, one represents the Persians, who became one empire. We explained the story, the history behind what happened, and it became one empire. So it grew and it worshipped the starry host until the Greeks came along with one big horn that came very, very quickly. And when it started, the big horn broke away and four smaller horns grew in its place. And so what's actually happening here, as I said, the two-horned ram is the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, which is Alexander the Great. And the four horns replace the large horn of the shaggy goat, represent the four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation. So is everybody aware that Alexander the Great died in his early 30s? He actually didn't live very long. Okay? So what actually happened is he wasn't married and he didn't have any children. So the leader of the greatest empire in the world had no one to take over from him. And so what happens, and we'll come to the future, is he had four generals who were his key men. And so Alexander the Great said to one of them, "I want you to rule in my place when I die." But of course the other three wouldn't accept it. So a squabble ensued, and what happened? It got broken up into four different parcels. And as a consequence, and we'll put this map up in a bigger form later on, it split into these four empires. And when you read the prophecy of Daniel, you might hear the reference to north, south, east and west. Okay? Now, when we're talking about north, south, east and west, the first thing that's important in the Bible is to know that the point that it's talking about, that every direction comes from, is Jerusalem. And so when we define north, south, east and west, we're talking about from this point of Jerusalem. So the Seleucid Empire, which is from this side here, which was one of the generals, right? It's classed as to the west, which is incorrect. It should be to the east. I beg your pardon. There you go. I've made a mistake. So that should be to the east. Now the Antagonian Empire that's here, we've got this off. We've got it to the north of. We've got these kingdoms here which are further to the north, and then we've got this down here, the Ptolemaic Empire to the south. So the south is the Egyptian Empire. So the Ptolemies end up becoming pharaohs, and again we're going to go into all of this with the Bible, but this becomes the pharaohs and the pharaonic dynasties in the future. The ones that are called to the north are the northernmost, and they were actually two kingdoms that sort of acted as one region. And so he's talking about this. So we've got one region, two regions, three regions, and four regions. And so the Antagonian Empire, as you can see here, is predominantly what we call Turkey today. Okay, so we've got the Greeks, modern day Turkey, then over here we go through a whole range of countries, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and so on over here, and then we've got Egypt down to here. So this is the four horns that came after the Greek Empire. So Alexander the Great was actually a Macedonian, so he came from here, and it talks about him coming from the west at such a rapid rate, and he took over the known world. And then when it splintered, it ended up going to these four components, which is what these prophetic words of Daniel is talking about. But he also mentions at the end of what's going to happen, he talks about the abomination of desolation in Jerusalem, when the Greeks in the future will place the god Zeus in the temple. But the other abomination of desolation, of course, is when Jesus came, he said what? In 70 years that the temple would be destroyed and would never be rebuilt again until his return. So there is more than one event that the temple is desecrated. Okay? And then we have the end of times. And so these pictures here, Cyrus the Great, Alexander the Great, and this is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and he is the one that they're talking about who will do all the damage in the temple. And so so just on a final note, when I spoke about Antiochus just there, the one who will do the desecration of the temple, the scripture in Daniel 8 verses 23 to 24 said, "A stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise." I don't know if you noticed, but even his bust, if you stern-faced, you can see it's not a soft, it's no smile, it's just this absolute blank. And there's many busts and carvings and pictures of this man, and they're always the same. They show him as this stern face, so bears out the biblical description. So the Persian Achaemenid Empire is actually made up of Medes and Persians combined. In Daniel's vision, one ram's horn grew higher than the other. So when the archangel Gabriel told him the ram with two horns represented the kings of Media and Persia, Persia was represented by the higher horn because it was the dominant power. This was also revealed in Daniel's previous vision of the second beast, who looked like a bear when he said it was raised up on one of its sides. Both visions placed Persia higher than Media to make clear its leadership over the new empire, an empire portrayed to spread and conquer in three directions from its capital in Susa. Now, prophesied by name in the book of Isaiah, so we're talking a fair time now, we're told that King Cyrus the Great will accomplish 150 years before his birth. The Lord said in Isaiah 44 verse 28, "He is my shepherd and will accomplish all that I please." And in chapter 45 verse 1 he said, "This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him." And so Isaiah prophesied about Cyrus as well. So the second component of Daniel's vision, the shaggy goat, represents the future Hellenistic or Greek Empire. It has its large horn broken off. This large horn is Alexander the Great, and its brokenness is his young death. He will be replaced by four new weaker kingdoms and kings who will all persecute God's people. The third component of Daniel's vision, the master of intrigue, or the small horn of Daniel 8 verse 9, is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, one of the future kings of one of the four new kingdoms, the Seleucid Empire. He will do an abundant array of evil to the Jewish people and desecrate the house of the Lord in the rebellion that causes desolation, also known as the abomination of desolation. And the final component of Daniel's vision, in which he is told, "Seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future," refers to the Messiah, Jesus, and he is the Prince of Princes that's mentioned in the prophecy. This vision aligns with the interpretation Daniel gave of the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2 verse 44, when he said, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever." Okay. And so, a lot, as always, to take in. There's a lot of history in this part of the Bible, but to actually follow the book of Daniel, you actually have to become au fait with the history of what's going on at the time, because to understand the sequence of events, we come to the book of Ezra, we come to the book of Nehemiah, whole books of the Bible, and they're wholly written and about the Persian Empire, whom we're talking about is about to come. And so we're introducing them now, and we're actually introducing them from prophecies of Daniel and others, which then turn into actual events as we go along in history. So tonight we've explained some of the backstory from where King Cyrus came from, and then now we see that the Babylonian Empire is starting to be eroded or penetrated, and they're also down to their last king and king's son. And so next week, when we look at the final portion of the life of Shealtiel up until Zerubbabel, it's going to be the demise of the Babylonian Empire and the arrival of King Cyrus the Great, who will of course release the Jews from Babylonian exile to return to Jerusalem again. And then we have a huge amount of biblical content, which is no longer just prophetic, but it's actually historically recorded as well. And so that's where we head next. So thank you for joining us tonight. I'll just pop on our end screen. If you'd like to watch this again, you can watch it here on Facebook. It'll also be put up on YouTube within the next day to our YouTube channel, Paul Brunson, the Jesus Movement, and also onto our website at jesusmovement.com.au. So thanks very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed. As I said, please watch it back. It will help you to work through all of the detail and to reread the biblical scripture. And we look forward to your company next time.